loves, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. Hi, hello, my name is Loey, and today is going to be a bit of a darker video. You guys know I like to tell my own paranormal stories. I like to talk about ghosts. I like to talk about spooky things. Today in particular, we are going to be talking about 5 of the absolute scariest true cases of demonic possession and in some cases exorcism. Halloween is in full swing, and there is nothing that scares me more than the idea of being possessed. I genuinely believe that I watched a friend of mine get possessed. I really genuinely believe that it happened, and it has to be the scariest thing in the world for someone to go through, because I know that for me it was the scariest thing in the world to watch happen. I'm gonna actually link that video down below. It was one of my first ever scary / paranormal stories, so it was a bit of a baby and I kind of drag on, but it is definitely worth listening to if you like the crap spooked out of ya. Before we get into the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below. I found out recently that over half of my views every single month are from people who aren't even subscribed. Join the family, join the squad. We would love to have you, and all this month I'm gonna be uploading super spooky stuff. This first story might also be one of the most famous of all time, and that is of Annalise Michael. And if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because her story was what The Exorcism of Emily Rose, a movie back in 2005, was kind of based off of. And it took her story, and of course they made a fiction with it, and they took some liberty with certain things, but her life was the mold for the story. Annalise was a very troubled girl who spent a lot of time in the mental hospital, and she was about 16 years old when her case really started taking place. It was in 1973 that things really started taking a turn for Annalise, and she shunned away all religious artifacts, crosses, Bibles, anything that you would put in front of her. She turned it away. Medicine wasn't helping her. She was like a completely different person. Annalise was mentally ill, but these things that she was doing now were unheard of for her. She was hearing voices she had never heard before. She was even drinking her own urine. She was heavily suicidal, and her family felt that medicine was doing literally nothing for this girl, not even sedating her. In moments of clarity, Annalise begged her family to bring in a priest because she knew that she was being possessed and she could feel it in her soul. And her family continually reached out to priests, all of whom pretty much denied their claims because this girl had a history of mental illness and they thought she was just mentally ill. This story is very controversial because 2 priests came in and secretly began performing the exorcism, which is number 1, a big no-no. You're supposed to have permission, and over the course of, I guess, a long time, it says here a year, she was having these exorcisms performed as an attempt to expel the demon from her. But at the same time, her family had taken her off of her medication for her epilepsy and other diagnosed mental disorders, and she died within that year. She didn't die because her medication was gone, but she did die because over the next several months, she refused to eat. She had over 70 exorcisms performed on her, and she just became a skeleton of herself. There is a lot of footage of her exorcisms on YouTube. I'm gonna play a little bit right now, but I warn you in advance, it's pretty disturbing. Annalise died a year after the exorcisms began, and her parents and the priests were both charged with negligent homicide. Number 4 is particularly interesting because it is deemed a possession story by an actual psychiatrist. Dr. Richard E. Gallagher in 2008 had a patient who he has since named Julia. This is so interesting because it's so rare that a psychiatrist would ever say something like this. I mean, a man who has so much knowledge in mental illness and science, someone who knows what mental illness looks like, genuinely believes that Julia was actually possessed. During his time with the patient, Dr. Gallagher experienced things that he could not explain. Things flying around the room, Julia levitating off of her bed. She knew things that she could not have physically known. She knew details and things about people that didn't make any sense. She started speaking in tongues she had never spoken in before. This is really common with demonic possession, where people will start speaking in new languages or speaking in tongues that they've literally never known before. This is an exact statement from Dr. Gallagher. Periodically in our presence, Julia would go into a trance state of reoccurring nature. Mentally troubled individuals often disassociate, but Julia's trances were accompanied by an unusual phenomenon. Out of her mouth would come various threats, taunts, and scatological language. Phrases like, "Leave her alone, you idiot," "She's ours," "Leave, you imbecile priest," or "Just leave." The tone of this voice differed markedly from Julia's own, and it varied, sometimes sounding guttural and vaguely masculine, and at other points high-pitched. Most of her comments during these trances or at subsequent exorcisms displayed a marked contempt for anything religious or sacred. Number 3 is incredibly interesting, and a story I had to do a little bit of extra digging to get to the bottom of, because the source that I was originally using didn't quite have the story right, and I was so confused. This story is very interesting though, and worth digging into, trust me. This is the case of Arne Cheyenne Johnson. I hope it's Arne and not Arnie. I couldn't find like a pronunciation anywhere, but this is the case of a man who killed his landlord, and the defense argued that he was possessed by a demon. There was a young boy named David Glatzel who was living with Arne Johnson. And I'm not entirely certain why David was living with him. I can't find any information on if this was his uncle, if he was living for him for a reason, or if he was just staying short term. I don't fully understand, but David was an 11-year-old boy who was very, very, very troubled. David's parents were so upset and traumatized and horrified by the things that their son was doing that they actually reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, who, if you've watched a few of my other videos, you may know are incredibly famed demonologists. They know a lot about the paranormal, but they were called in to help, and they actually performed an exorcism on the 11-year-old boy to try to expel the demon. And it didn't really seem to work, because when David was living with Arne, suddenly out of nowhere, it was like a light switch flipped and he went seemingly crazy and killed his landlord. Of course, the argument that he was possessed didn't really hold up in court, but still an interesting case nonetheless. And actually, he only served 5 out of a 10 to 20 year sentence in jail for killing his landlord. It's kind of strange and makes me wonder why he only served 5 years. That's weird for like actual murder. Number 2 is the story of Anna Uckland. Again, I hope that's how you say her name correctly. Anna was only 14 when she began showing signs of possession, and these signs included really, really, really disturbing thoughts, unspeakable sexual acts, which I don't even want to know. She was 14, and also she could not enter a church, and she also could not stand any religious artifacts. Before this, Anna was actually pretty normal. Anna was raised a strict Catholic. However, her father and his mistress regularly practiced witchcraft and would taint her food with herbs. Shortly after this was when she became possessed. She underwent a successful exorcism. She was cured, but apparently her father was a monster because he and his mistress literally prayed to Satan for her to get worse. And in that same year that she was cured, she was possessed by many, many, many spirits, some of which are even rumored to be the same ones that possessed Annalise Michael. When she could, she sought help from the church, and she was placed in a covenant to await her exorcism. And while she was in the care of nuns at this covenant, things seemed to get so much worse. When the nuns would bless the food before it entered the room, Anna could tell when they had blessed the food and when they had not. She refused to eat any food that had been blessed, would hiss and spit at the nuns, throw it on the floor, and starve instead of eating the food that had been blessed. Like Annalise, she began speaking in tongues and in languages she had never known before, which is petrifying to even think about. I have heard like footage of some exorcisms where people will start speaking in tongues and start speaking in like French or Latin or just like things that they shouldn't know, and it's pretty freaking scary. She would vomit and spit at the priest. She would levitate. She would climb up walls and literally defy gravity. She was possessed if anyone had ever been possessed before. And after 23 straight days and 3 exorcisms, the priest declared her cured, and that is where her story ends. I think the scariest to me is the people who start speaking in tongues, or the people who do things that just don't make any sense. Can you imagine being someone who is a scientist or a doctor, let's say, like the man earlier who had the Julia case, or being a priest who believes in, you know, a God, but seeing these impossible things happen around you has to be really weird. Number 1 is a little bit of a double hitter. In 1976, 6 people were murdered by a serial killer in New York City known as the Son of Sam, or the 44 caliber killer. 6 people killed, 7 severely wounded, and this period was known as the Summer of Sam. So the police were on basically a crazy chase with this man, chasing him as much as they could, and they weren't getting to the bottom of the serial killer case over the course of a year. When the Son of Sam killer was finally identified and brought in, he immediately admitted everything, and he was like, yes, I did all of this, and it wasn't me. A demon made me do this. But what's interesting is technically he didn't claim to be possessed. He said his neighbor's dog was possessed and that his neighbor's dog forced him to do the killings, to kill people. This didn't hold up very well, and he was sentenced to 6 separate life sentences. But what's interesting is back in the 90s, he came forward and added an amendment to his confession and said he had actually been in a satanic cult. That cult was the reason that the murders were performed, not some possessed dog or something like that. The cult themselves had actually orchestrated the murders, but the case was closed. I think that's interesting because honestly, that story is so unbelievable, and clearly that man was smart enough to avoid the police, to get away with being a serial killer for over a year. Very clearly, he knew better than to say a dog was possessed and a dog made him do it. It makes me wonder if he was afraid and hiding the truth, that the satanic cult really had orchestrated all of these murders. That part I believe. This was a weird video, and I hope you guys liked it. If you did, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I love you all very much, and I'll catch you in the next video. This one was a little bit dark, I know, but next time we'll do something a little bit more fun and light. Stay spooky, my friends. I love you. Bye.